Welcome to This Explainer. We are jumping right into one of the most fascinating historical paradoxes of the modern world. I mean, we're talking about two massive nations here, built on the exact same ideological blueprint, operating in the exact same century, but getting completely, wildly opposite outcomes. It's this incredible story of how a system can be programmed identically, yet produce a thriving superpower on one side of the globe and total chaotic collapse on the other. And why this matters for us today is that the legacy of these two paths literally defines our modern geopolitical reality. Just picture December 1991 for a second. The hammer and sickle flag is coming down over the Kremlin for the very last time. The largest communist state in human history is just gone, broken up into 15 separate countries. But then look at the contrast. Fast forward to today, thousands of miles away, and another communist party is still firmly in power. They're running the second largest economy on Earth, launching space stations, building the world's fastest train networks. It's night and day.
So, why exactly did communism die in Moscow but absolutely thrive in Beijing? Okay, let's dive into this, because the answer really isn't what you might typically hear. Today, we're going to impartially reverse engineer this giant geopolitical machine using our source material to figure out exactly what happened. To understand the collapse of one and the rise of the other, we really have to look under the hood at the mechanics of how they were governed.
Right off the bat, we need to bust a major myth. China and the USSR were not opposites. Actually, they were siblings. Mao literally modeled China's early communist state directly on Stalin's USSR. They shared the exact same starting blueprint. We're talking collectivized farms, rigid 5-year plans, a single all-powerful party, and absolutely no private business, the whole shebang. Both believed the Communist Party didn't just run the government, it literally was the government, permanently, with zero opposition allowed. Since their starting points were nearly identical, the massive difference in their fates comes down entirely to what they chose to do next.
So fast forward to the 1980s. The Soviet machine was, well, it was quietly dying. Decades of a centrally planned economy meant factories were just churning out whatever a centralized plan dictated, completely disconnected from what everyday people actually needed. Innovation wasn't just ignored, it was actively punished. And to make matters worse, oil prices, which were basically the USSR's main lifeline for hard currency, crashed in the mid-80s, pulling the entire national budget down with them. It was a desperate, failing system that Mikhail Gorbachev ended up inheriting.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how Gorbachev tried to fix that broken machine. He decided to pull two massive levers at the exact same time. The first one was perestroika. This basically translates to restructuring. It was his big attempt to save the dying economy by loosening up state control and trying to inject some much-needed flexibility into the rigid Soviet market.
But here is the catch. The second lever Gorbachev pulled, simultaneously, was glasnost, openness. For the very first time in decades, the state allowed free speech and let the press openly criticize the government. It was a radical, massive shift. But pulling both of these levers at the exact same time, that set up a fatal flaw in his reform sequencing.
Here's how that simultaneous approach completely dissolved the USSR instead of fixing it. It happened in basically 3 steps. Step 1. Gorbachev opened the political valve before fixing the empty store shelves. So suddenly, people had the freedom to say, hey, this system doesn't work, while they were actively starving. Step 2. Glasnost exposed decades of buried history. Purges, famines, state lies. It totally destroyed the public's trust, leaving the party with zero legitimacy. And step 3, because that political grip was loosened, nationalist movements in places like Ukraine and the Baltics simply looked around, seized the moment, and walked out. The combination was literally lethal to the state.
Now, let's rewind slightly and look over at post-1976 China. After Mao died, Deng Xiaoping came to power. And this brilliantly illustrates his entirely different mindset. He famously said, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice." This was a massive, pragmatic shift. Deng didn't care if a policy was technically labeled capitalist or communist. He only cared if it produced tangible, real-world economic results.
Starting in 1978, Deng put that pragmatism into action by aggressively opening up the economy. Farmers were finally allowed to sell their surplus crops for an actual profit. The old, failed commune systems were dismantled piece by piece, and China set up these special economic zones, like Shenzhen, where foreign investment and private businesses were suddenly perfectly legal. The result? Visible year-after-year economic enrichment for the average person.
So the crucial point here is the sheer contrast in their approaches. While Gorbachev paired a collapsing economy with political openness, Deng made the exact opposite bet. Deng pushed sweeping economic liberalization, but kept a strict, ironclad political monopoly. I mean, no opposition parties allowed, no free press. China ran a thriving, opening economy directly alongside uncompromising political control. The unspoken deal was basically this: the party delivers economic growth, and the people do not ask for democracy.
But you know, that unspoken deal was put to its absolute ultimate test in 1989. It was a year of global upheaval. Communist governments across Eastern Europe were falling like dominoes. And in Beijing, students and workers gathered in Tiananmen Square. Inspired in part by that Glasnost-era openness happening over in the USSR right at that very moment, they demanded political reform to match the economic changes.
Faced with this demand, China's leadership made a decisive militaristic choice. They chose to crush the protests militarily. The party made it absolutely, unmistakably clear that economic reform would never be permitted to evolve into political reform. Looking right next door at the unraveling Soviet Union, the Chinese leadership basically used the USSR as their internal warning system. They effectively slammed the political valve permanently shut to ensure the state's survival.
When we map this all out chronologically, the divergence is just striking. By 1978, China begins economic-only reforms. By 1985, Gorbachev attempts his dual economic and political reforms. In 1989, China shuts down political dissent at Tiananmen, while Eastern Europe begins to break away, and by 1991, the Soviet Union collapses completely. These completely distinct approaches to control and sequencing were playing out side by side during the exact same era, leading to wildly opposite destinies. Let's move to and see how this builds into one final, massive difference between the two: the speed of their economic changes. When the USSR and the states that emerged from it finally attempted economic reform, they used what's known as shock therapy. China, on the other hand, went with gradualism. This difference in speed and state control turned out to be just as critical as their difference in political openness.
Because, wow, shock therapy in the post-Soviet 1990s was chaotic and utterly devastating. The goal was to rapidly privatize state industries and remove price controls almost overnight. But trying to change literally everything simultaneously, it resulted in massive hyperinflation. Entire industries were just gutted. A small group of opportunistic oligarchs swooped in to seize state assets for pennies on the dollar. The economic collapse was so severe that the average life expectancy for a Russian citizen actually dropped during this period. Just let that sink in.
Conversely, China's gradualism was this highly controlled step-by-step process. They reformed one sector, watched the results, adjusted, and only then moved to the next. They started with agriculture, then allowed small private enterprises, then slowly opened foreign trade zones, and finally addressed heavy industry decades later. This slow, deliberate pace allowed China's leadership to catch and fix their mistakes early, before they could compound into national catastrophes.
So, when we step back and look at all the sources, a very clear overarching lesson emerges here. The survival of these massive states wasn't really about which version of Marxist ideology was correct. It came down entirely to sequencing and control. The USSR tried to change everything, the economy and the politics, all at once, and they lost control of both. China changed one thing at a time, maintained an iron grip on political power, and used their incredible economic success to justify keeping that grip. Which leaves us with a massive, provocative question to wrap up this explainer. When you consider the private businesses, the foreign investment, the billionaires, is China's modern model actually communism anymore? Or is it simply a highly efficient, state-controlled capitalism that just happens to be wearing communism's flag? It's a fascinating debate about an incredible historical paradox. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this breakdown helped clarify exactly how these two nations took such radically different paths. Drop your thoughts on that final question in the comments below, and keep learning.